here's something that should bother you. Something that, once you notice it, you won't be able to stop thinking about. You are a member of the species Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, people with brains exactly like yours, bodies exactly like yours, the same capacity for language and thought and creativity that you possess right now, lying there in the dark, listening to these words. And your species is old, much older than you probably realize. The earliest fossils of anatomically modern humans date back approximately 300,000 years. 300,000 years of people who looked like you, thought like you, dreamed like you. 300 millennia of human beings walking the earth, raising children, watching sunsets, wondering about the stars. Now here's the part that should keep you up at night. Or since you're using this to fall asleep, maybe let it drift you into strange dreams instead. Of those 300,000 years of human existence, we have detailed records for about 5,000. Writing, the technology that allows us to record our thoughts and pass them down through generations, was only invented around 3,200 BCE in Mesopotamia. Everything before that moment exists in shadow. Everything before that moment has to be reconstructed from fragments, from artifacts, from bones and stones, and the faint traces our ancestors left behind. But here's where it gets stranger. Even within that vast unwritten period, there's a particular gap that haunts archaeologists and anthropologists. A void that doesn't make sense. A mystery that suggests we're missing something enormous about our own story. For the first 200,000 years of our existence as a species, we did almost nothing, or at least that's what the archaeological record suggests. For 200,000 years, anatomically modern humans lived on this planet with the same brains we have today, the same cognitive potential, the same biological hardware for language and abstract thought and innovation. And yet, for most of that time, we left behind almost no evidence of the creativity and symbolic thinking that defines us now. No elaborate cave paintings, no complex tools, no jewelry or ornaments, no signs of long-distance trade, no evidence of boats or navigation, no musical instruments, no structured burials with grave goods, nothing that looks like art or religion or culture in the way we understand those terms. For 200,000 years, humans with brains identical to yours lived what appears to be remarkably simple lives. They made the same basic stone tools their ancestors had made for hundreds of thousands of years before them. They lived in small groups. They hunted and gathered. They survived. But they didn't seem to innovate. They didn't seem to create. They didn't seem to do any of the things that we think of as quintessentially human. And then, somewhere between 100,000 and 50,000 years ago, everything changed. Suddenly, or at least suddenly in archaeological terms, humans started behaving differently. They started making complex tools. They started creating art. They started decorating their bodies with jewelry. They started burying their dead with care and ritual. They started trading goods over vast distances. They started doing things that had never been done before in the entire history of life on Earth. This transformation is so dramatic that scientists have given it a name. They call it the Human Revolution, or the Great Leap Forward, or the Upper Paleolithic Revolution. Different researchers use different terms, but they're all trying to describe the same phenomenon. The moment when humans stopped just surviving and started being fully, recognizably, unmistakably human. But here's the question that haunts every researcher who studies this period. The question that keeps them awake at night and drives them to dig through ancient sediments and analyze fragments of bone and stone. The question that, tonight, I'm going to explore with you as you drift towards sleep. What were we doing for those first 200,000 years? If we had the cognitive capacity for art and innovation and complex culture, why didn't we use it? If our brains were ready, why did it take so long for our behavior to catch up? Were we really doing nothing all that time, or have we just failed to find the evidence of what our ancestors accomplished? Is the archaeological record telling us the truth, or is it lying to us, hiding vast chapters of human achievement beneath the ocean, under the sand, lost forever to time and decay? If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I made it. So settle in, get comfortable, pull the covers up, and let me take you on a journey through the longest and most mysterious period in human history. Let me tell you about the 200,000 years we can't explain, the centuries upon centuries when humans existed but didn't seem to fully live, the gap in our story that might contain secrets we're only beginning to understand. This is the tale of what we did before we became who we are, This is the story of the missing years, and it begins with a simple question that turns out to be impossibly complex. What does it mean to be human? Chapter 1. The Paradox of the Modern Mind. Let's start with what we know. Let's establish the facts before we dive into the mysteries. The oldest known fossils of Homo sapiens come from a site called Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. In 2017, a team of researchers announced that they had dated these fossils to approximately 300,000 years ago, pushing back the origin of our species by 100,000 years from previous estimates. The Jebel Irhoud humans weren't quite identical to people today. Their skulls were slightly different in shape, more elongated at the back. But they were clearly us, clearly Homo sapiens, clearly members of the same species that would eventually build cities and write symphonies and send robots to Mars. Other early Homo sapiens fossils have been found across Africa. The Omo remains from Ethiopia, dating to about 195,000 years ago. The Herto skulls, also from Ethiopia, around 160,000 years old. Fossils from South Africa, from Tanzania, from various sites across the continent that was our evolutionary cradle. By 200,000 years ago, anatomically modern humans were definitely present in Africa. They had brains averaging about 1,350 cubic centimeters, essentially the same size as modern humans. They had the same basic body proportions we have today. They had the same vocal apparatus that allows us to produce the complex sounds of human language. They had hands capable of the fine motor control needed for intricate tool-making and artistic creation. In every measurable biological sense, these people were us. If you could somehow transport a baby from 200,000 years ago to the present day and raise them in a modern family, there's no reason to think they couldn't learn to read and write, drive a car, use a smartphone, go to college, become a doctor or an artist or an engineer. The hardware was all there. The biological potential was identical to what you carry in your skull right now. And yet. For most of the time between 300,000 years ago and about 50,000 years ago, these biologically modern humans left behind remarkably little evidence of the behavioral complexity we associate with humanity. This is what researchers call the paradox of the modern mind. The puzzle of why anatomy and behavior seem to have been so out of sync. The mystery of why it took so long for our species to start acting like, well, our species. Consider the archaeological evidence from this period. Or rather, consider what's missing from it. For most of the first 200,000 years of Homo sapiens' existence, our ancestors made stone tools using techniques that had been established hundreds of thousands of years earlier by previous human species. The basic approach was simple. Take a stone core, strike it with another stone to remove flakes, and use either the flakes or the shaped core as cutting tools. This technology, called the Middle Stone Age in Africa, or the Middle Paleolithic in Europe, was effective but not particularly innovative. The same basic tool types appear across vast stretches of time and space, with relatively little variation or improvement. Compare this to what came later. After the behavioral revolution, humans started producing an explosion of different tool types. Blades struck from carefully prepared cores, bone and antler tools, composite tools with multiple parts hafted together, specialized implements for specific tasks. The toolkit expanded dramatically, and it kept expanding with new innovations appearing regularly. But for 200,000 years, the toolkit stayed largely the same. Or consider art and symbolic expression. After the revolution, humans created the stunning cave paintings of Chauvet and Lascaux and Altamira. They carved figurines from ivory and stone. They made jewellery from shells and teeth and bone. They decorated their tools and their bodies with elaborate designs. The archaeological record explodes with creativity. But for most of the first 200,000 years, almost nothing. A few possible examples of symbolic behaviour scattered across hundreds of millennia, a handful of sites that might show early artistic expression. But nothing like the flood of creativity that came later. Or consider long-distance exchange. After the revolution, humans started trading materials over hundreds of miles. Obsidian from volcanic sources appears at sites far from where it originated. Shells from the ocean appear at inland sites. People were connected across vast distances, exchanging not just raw materials but presumably ideas and information as well. But for most of the first 200,000 years, most tools were made from local materials. Most groups seem to have been relatively isolated. The social networks that would later span continents were, as far as we can tell, much more limited. This pattern repeats across every category of behavior we might examine. Complex burial practices, rare before 50,000 years ago, common afterward. Evidence of structured living spaces with designated areas for different activities, rare before, common afterward. Signs of planning and preparation for future needs, limited before, abundant afterward. The contrast is stark enough that some researchers have argued there must have been a biological change, some genetic mutation that rewired the brain and unlocked capabilities that had been dormant, some evolutionary event that transformed human cognition and made the revolution possible. The leading candidate for this hypothetical change involves language. Perhaps, the argument goes, early Homo sapiens didn't have fully developed language. Perhaps they could communicate, but not with the complexity and abstraction that true language allows. And perhaps, somewhere around 50,000 to 100,000 years ago, a genetic change occurred that gave humans the full language faculty. Once they could talk properly, everything else followed. Art, technology, trade, religion, all the hallmarks of behavioral modernity, all flowing from the ability to share complex ideas through words. This theory is elegant. It explains why biology and behavior were out of sync. It provides a clear mechanism for the change, and it has some support from genetics, where certain genes associated with language ability show signs of recent positive selection. But there are problems with this theory, significant problems that have become more apparent as research has accumulated. The first problem is anatomical. The physical structures needed for speech, including the shape of the throat and the position of the larynx, were present in humans long before the behavioral revolution. The hyoid bone, which supports the tongue and is crucial for speech, looks essentially modern in Homo sapiens fossils from 200,000 years ago. Whatever changes might have affected language, they weren't changes to the basic physical equipment. The second problem is genetic. While there have been some genetic changes related to brain function in the last 200,000 years, there's no clear evidence of a sudden major mutation that transformed cognition. The genes we can study suggest gradual change, not a single revolutionary event. The third problem, and perhaps the most significant, is archaeological. Because as researchers have looked more carefully at the first 200,000 years of human existence, they've started finding things. Signs of behavioral complexity that are much older than the supposed revolution. Evidence that our ancestors were doing sophisticated, symbolic, recognizably human things long before 50,000 years ago. And this is where the mystery deepens. Because if early humans were capable of complex behavior, if they did occasionally create art and engage in symbolic thinking and innovate technologically, why didn't they do it consistently? Why does the evidence appear sporadically, flickering in and out across thousands of years, never quite catching fire until much later? The paradox isn't that early humans couldn't behave like modern humans. The paradox is that they could, but mostly didn't. They had the capacity, but they rarely used it. They were capable of revolution, but they stayed conservative. Why? That question will guide us through the next several chapters. We'll look at the evidence for early behavioral complexity. We'll explore the theories that try to explain the pattern. We'll consider what the missing 200,000 years might really have looked like, beneath the silence of the archaeological record. But first, let's take a closer look at what our ancestors were actually doing during all those millennia. Because even if they weren't painting caves or carving figurines, they weren't doing nothing. They were surviving. They were adapting. They were living lives that, while different from ours, were no less meaningful to them. Let's go back to the beginning of our species and imagine what life was like before the revolution. Let's try to understand our ancestors not by what they failed to do, but by what they actually did. Chapter 2. Life before the revolution. Close your eyes and let the present fall away. Let the hum of modern life fade into silence. Let the cities dissolve, the roads vanish, the farms and factories and everything you know about civilization disappear like morning mist. You're going back now, back through thousands of years, back through tens of thousands, back through hundreds of thousands, back to a time when humans existed but the world was utterly different from anything you've ever experienced. It is 200,000 years ago. You're somewhere in Eastern Africa, perhaps in what is now Ethiopia or Kenya. The landscape around you is a mosaic of environments. Grasslands dotted with acacia trees, patches of denser woodland along rivers and streams, rocky outcrops providing shelter and vantage points. In the distance, mountains rise against a sky that looks exactly like the sky you know, because it is the same sky, the same sun, the same moon and stars that humans have looked up at for all of our existence. You're a member of a small band of humans, perhaps 20 or 30 individuals, several family groups bound together by kinship and necessity. There are elders who have seen 40 or 50 seasons. Though they look ancient by modern standards, their faces weathered, their bodies bearing the marks of a hard life. There are adults in the prime of life, strong and capable. There are children of various ages learning the skills they'll need to survive. There are infants carried by their mothers, nursing and sleeping and gradually becoming aware of the world. This is your whole society. These 20 or 30 people are everyone you know. You might occasionally encounter other bands, other groups of humans wandering through the same landscape. These encounters might be friendly, involving trade and the exchange of marriage partners, or they might be tense, two groups competing for the same resources. But most of the time, it's just your band, your family, your people. Your day begins before dawn. The equatorial sun rises quickly, and the cool hours of early morning are precious time for activity before the heat becomes oppressive. You wake on the ground, perhaps in the shelter of a rock overhang or beneath a tree, your body curled against others for warmth and protection. There are no beds, no blankets, no pillows, just the earth beneath you and the bodies of your kin around you. If your band has fire, and they probably do since fire use goes back hundreds of thousands of years before Homo sapiens evolved, then someone has been tending it through the night, keeping the embers alive, watching for predators whose eyes might gleam in the darkness beyond the circle of light. Fire is life. Fire is safety. Fire is what allows you to sleep without being eaten by the leopards and lions and hyenas that share your world. Breakfast is whatever can be found quickly. Perhaps some leftover meat from yesterday's hunting if there was any. Perhaps tubers or roots that were gathered and roasted. Perhaps nothing at all if times are hard. There's no guarantee of food, no expectation of regular meals. You eat when you can, what you can, and you learn to function through hunger. Then the day's work begins. And by work I mean the constant, unending task of acquiring enough calories to survive. The women and older children typically focus on gathering. This isn't a casual activity. It's a complex skill that requires encyclopedic knowledge of the local environment. Which plants are edible and which are poisonous. Where to find tubers at this time of year. Which trees are fruiting. Where the beehives are located. How to dig for water in a dry riverbed. How to catch small animals, lizards and tortoises and insects that provide crucial protein. This knowledge isn't written down. It can't be. Writing won't exist for another 195,000 years. Everything must be memorized. Everything must be passed from mother to daughter, from grandmother to granddaughter, through demonstration and practice and repetition. A lifetime of learning compressed into the brains of the oldest women in the band. The men typically focus on hunting, though the division of labour isn't absolute. Everyone does what needs to be done. Hunting 200,000 years ago is a very different activity from what you might imagine. These aren't mighty hunters bringing down mammoths with spears. They're opportunistic predators taking whatever they can get. Sometimes that means tracking wounded animals, following blood trails until the prey weakens enough to be finished off. Sometimes it means scavenging, finding carcasses killed by other predators, and driving off the competition with numbers and noise and fire. Sometimes it means ambush hunting, waiting at waterholes for animals to come drink. Sometimes it means persistence hunting, the technique humans are uniquely evolved for, chasing prey for hours under the hot sun until the animal collapses from heat exhaustion. The tools available for hunting are simple but effective. Wooden spears, perhaps fire-hardened at the tip. Stone points that can be hafted onto wooden shafts. Throwing sticks. Clubs. Nothing fancy by later standards, but enough to kill when the opportunity arises. Hunting is dangerous. Large animals fight back. Predators don't appreciate competition. Injuries are common and often fatal without modern medicine. A broken leg means death. An infected wound means death. A bad fall means death. Every hunt is a gamble with life itself, and the success rate is low. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers suggest that hunting fails far more often than it succeeds. Men might come back empty-handed most days, relying on the gathered foods that women provide to fill the gap. Meat is precious when it appears. shared among the group according to complex social rules that ensure everyone gets some. But it's not the daily staple that movies about cavemen might suggest. The gathered foods are the foundation. Tubers and roots provide carbohydrates, nuts and seeds provide fats, fruits provide sugars and vitamins, insects and small animals provide protein. It's a varied diet, probably more varied than what most modern people eat, but it requires constant effort to maintain. By midday, the heat is too intense for much activity. Your band rests in whatever shade can be found. People sleep, groom each other, tend to children, repair tools, talk. This is social time, bonding time, the hours when relationships are maintained and strengthened. What do they talk about? We can't know for certain. The question of whether humans 200,000 years ago had fully developed language is one of the great debates in anthropology. But they certainly communicated. They had to. Coordinating hunting, sharing information about food sources, maintaining social relationships, teaching children, all of these require communication. Whether that communication had the full grammatical complexity of modern language or was something simpler, a proto-language of gestures and simple vocalizations remains unknown. But they talked, or signed, or somehow shared information, that much is certain. In the late afternoon, as the heat begins to fade, activity resumes. More gathering, more hunting if the morning was unsuccessful, preparation for the night ahead, finding or returning to a safe sleeping spot, building up the fire, arranging the social space, and then darkness falls. Quickly, this close to the equator. One moment the sun is above the horizon, the next it's gone, and the African night descends with all its sounds and dangers. Night is when the predators are most active. The leopards and lions that have learned to avoid humans during the day become bolder in the darkness. The fire helps. The presence of the group helps. But the night is still dangerous. Sleep comes in fits and starts, interrupted by strange sounds, by the need to feed the fire, by infants crying and children having nightmares, and then dawn comes again, and the cycle repeats. Day after day, season after season, year after year, generation after generation, for thousands upon thousands of years. This is what life was like for your ancestors during the missing 200,000 years. Not dramatic, not romantic, not the exciting adventure of popular imagination, just the grinding, relentless work of survival. Finding enough food, avoiding predators, raising children, staying alive long enough to pass your genes to the next generation. It's tempting to look at this life and see it as primitive, as lesser, as something to be transcended on the way to civilization and progress. But that would be a mistake, because this life required intelligence, it required knowledge, it required skills that most modern humans couldn't begin to match. Consider what it takes to survive as a hunter-gatherer. You need to know hundreds of plant species and their properties. You need to understand animal behavior well enough to predict where prey will be and how it will react. You need to navigate across a landscape without maps or GPS, building mental models of terrain that span hundreds of square miles. You need to read weather patterns, understand seasonal changes, anticipate droughts and floods. You need social intelligence too. In a small band where everyone knows everyone, where there's no escape from conflict, where cooperation is essential for survival, social skills matter enormously. Who can you trust? Who might betray you? How do you resolve disputes without violence that could cripple the group? How do you maintain alliances, find mates, raise children in a world without laws or institutions? Your ancestors weren't stupid. They weren't waiting around for civilization to be invented so they could finally start living meaningful lives. They were engaged in the most challenging endeavor any organism can face, the task of surviving in a dangerous world, and they were succeeding at it. They were doing something that most species that have ever existed failed to do. They were persisting. But they weren't innovating, at least not in ways that left clear archaeological traces. They weren't creating the explosion of art and technology that would come later. They had the brains for it, the biological capacity, but they weren't using that capacity. Or if they were, they weren't leaving evidence behind. Why not? What was holding them back? What would eventually change? To answer those questions, we need to look more carefully at what the archaeological record actually shows, because it turns out that the story is more complicated than a simple division between before and after the revolution. There are hints of complexity in the deep past. flickers of the human spark that would eventually ignite. Let's examine those hints. Let's look at the evidence that our ancestors were more than simple survivors, even during the supposedly empty millennia of the missing 200,000 years. Chapter 3. Flickers in the Darkness. The story I just told you, about 200,000 years of stagnation followed by sudden revolution, was the dominant narrative in archaeology for decades. It was neat. It was simple. It made for a compelling story about human progress. But science rarely stays simple for long. As researchers have dug deeper, literally and figuratively, into the early history of Homo sapiens, they've found things that complicate the picture. Evidence that behavioral complexity didn't suddenly appear 50,000 years ago, but emerged gradually, sporadically, flickering in and out across the long millennia. Let me take you to some of these sites. Let me show you the evidence that's reshaping our understanding of what our ancestors were capable of. Our first stop is Blombos Cave on the southern coast of South Africa. This site has produced some of the most remarkable evidence for early human symbolic behaviour, and it's far older than the supposed revolution. In layers dating to about 75,000 years ago, archaeologists found pieces of ochre, the red iron oxide mineral that would later be used extensively in cave paintings. But these weren't just random chunks of rock. They had been deliberately engraved with geometric patterns, cross-hatched lines forming a grid-like design, abstract patterns that served no practical purpose but clearly meant something to the people who made them. Think about what this represents. Someone 75,000 years ago, 25,000 years before the supposed revolution, sat down and carefully scratched a pattern into a piece of rock. Not to make a tool, not to butcher an animal, just to create a design, just to make a mark that expressed something beyond immediate practical need. That's symbolic behaviour. That's art in the broadest sense of the term. That's a human mind doing what human minds do, creating meaning through symbols. But Blombos has more. In the same layers, researchers found beads made from Nassarius shells, small marine shells that had been perforated, probably to string them together as jewellery, ornaments, decorations, things worn on the body to communicate something about the wearer's identity or status or group membership. This is exactly the kind of behaviour that was supposed to be absent before the revolution, and yet here it is, 75,000 years ago in a cave on the South African coast, and it gets older. Deeper layers at Blombos, dating to around 100,000 years ago, contain more engraved ochre and what appear to be paint-making kits, complete with abalone shells used as containers and grinding stones for preparing pigments. Someone was making paint 100,000 years ago. We don't know what they painted, whether it was their bodies or their tools or something else entirely, but they were creating coloured substances for purposes that went beyond simple utility. Blombos isn't alone. At Pinnacle Point, another site on the South African coast, researchers found evidence that humans were exploiting marine resources systematically by 164,000 years ago. Shells, fish bones, evidence of a coastal adaptation that required planning and organisation. They also found that these early humans were heat-treating stone to improve its flaking properties, a sophisticated technological technique that requires understanding of how heat changes material properties. At Deep Kloof Rock Shelter, also in South Africa, archaeologists found ostrich eggshells that had been engraved with patterns dating back 60,000 years. These weren't random scratches, but consistent design traditions that changed over time, suggesting cultural transmission across generations. In North Africa, at sites in Morocco, researchers have found shell beads dating back 82,000 years. In Israel, at Skul and Kafze, anatomically modern humans were burying their dead with apparent ritual treatment over 100,000 years ago. Skeletons placed in deliberate positions, grave goods like shells and ochre included in the burials, signs that these early humans had beliefs about death, that they cared for their dead in ways that went beyond simple disposal of bodies. The evidence keeps accumulating. Every few years, it seems, another discovery pushes back the origins of behavioural complexity. Another site reveals that our ancestors were doing sophisticated things earlier than we thought. And here's what makes this really interesting. These discoveries aren't spread evenly across time and space. They appear sporadically. They flicker. One site shows remarkable complexity, and then there's nothing comparable for thousands of years or thousands of miles. The behaviour appears, persists for a while, and then seems to vanish, only to reappear later somewhere else. At Blombos Cave itself, The layers with engraved ochre and shell beads are sandwiched between layers that show no such complexity. The behaviour was present, then absent, then present again. It came and went. This pattern has led some researchers to propose a new model for understanding the emergence of behavioural modernity. Not a sudden revolution triggered by a genetic change, but a gradual process of innovation and loss, of cultural traditions that emerged and then disappeared, of capabilities that were developed and then forgotten. Imagine being part of a small band of humans 80,000 years ago. Someone in your group invents something new, a new way of making tools, a new symbolic practice, a new technology for exploiting a food resource. Within your band, this innovation spreads. People learn it, teach it to their children, incorporate it into daily life. But your band is small, maybe 30 people, and it exists in a challenging environment where survival is never guaranteed. If the band suffers a catastrophe, if disease or drought or conflict kills too many people, the innovation might die with them. Even if the band survives, if it splits and the innovators end up in one group while the others go a different direction, the practice might be lost from half of the resulting population. Cultural evolution, unlike genetic evolution, can go backward. Traditions can be forgotten. Technologies can be lost. Things that took generations to develop can disappear in a single generation if the chain of transmission is broken. This is what researchers think might have happened during the missing 200,000 years. Our ancestors were capable of innovation. They did innovate, occasionally, in various times and places, but the innovations didn't stick. They didn't spread widely enough or persist long enough to leave the kind of continuous archaeological record that would show up clearly hundreds of thousands of years later. The flickering pattern makes sense when you consider the demographics of early human populations. For most of the Pleistocene, humans were rare. Total population might have been in the tens of thousands, spread across an entire continent. Individual bands were small and isolated. The social networks that would later allow ideas to spread across vast distances were limited or non-existent. In such conditions, innovation is fragile. A good idea in one place might never reach another place. A breakthrough technology might die with the small group that invented it. The cultural ratchet that would later allow human knowledge to accumulate across generations kept slipping backward, losing gains almost as quickly as they were made. But here's the crucial point. The capacity was there. The ability to innovate, to create symbols, to think abstractly, to make art. All of it was present in human brains long before the archaeological record shows it consistently. The revolution wasn't about acquiring new mental abilities. It was about creating the conditions that allowed those abilities to be expressed consistently and cumulatively. What were those conditions? What changed to make the revolution possible? That question has multiple answers, and we'll explore them in the coming chapters. But one factor stands out above all others, one change that seems to underlie all the rest: population. The revolution happened when there were enough people, connected in large enough networks, for innovations to spread faster than they could be lost. The revolution happened when the flickering sparks of human creativity finally had enough fuel to catch fire and burn continuously. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we explore why the revolution happened, let's spend more time in the world before it. Let's try to understand what life was like during those long millennia when humans had the capacity for greatness, but rarely expressed it. Because here's something important to remember. For your ancestors living through those times, life wasn't a waiting room. They weren't marking time until civilization could begin. They were living full lives, rich with meaning and purpose, even if they didn't leave behind the kinds of artifacts that archaeologists would later use to judge them. Let's go deeper into their world. Let's try to understand what mattered to them, what they thought about, what made their lives worth living even without art and cities and all the things we associate with being human. Chapter 4: The Invisible Richness. If you're still with me, if you're drifting towards sleep while listening to these words, I want you to consider something. Everything we've talked about so far, the stone tools and the shell beads and the engraved ochre, these are all things that survived, things that lasted for tens of thousands of years because they were made of durable materials and happened to be preserved in just the right conditions. But think about your own life. Think about what matters most to you. How much of it would survive 100,000 years? The conversations you have with people you love, gone. The songs you sing in the shower, gone. The stories you tell your children, gone. The jokes that make you laugh, the dreams that wake you in the night, the beliefs that give your life meaning, the relationships that sustain you. All of it, every bit of it, would vanish without a trace. If archaeologists from the far future tried to understand your life based only on the durable artifacts you leave behind, they would miss almost everything that makes you human. They would find your bones, maybe, your house, possibly, some of your possessions, if they were made of lasting materials, but your inner life, your social world, your culture in the deepest sense, all of that would be invisible to them. Now apply this insight to our ancestors 200,000 years ago. What are we missing? What can't we see? Let's start with language. The question of when fully modern language evolved is one of the most contentious in all of science. Precisely because language doesn't leave direct archaeological traces, words vanish as soon as they're spoken. Grammatical structures can't be fossilized. The entire edifice of human linguistic ability, the thing that most distinguishes us from other animals, is archaeologically invisible. But consider what language allows. It allows you to share information about things that aren't present, to talk about the past and the future, to discuss hypotheticals and counterfactuals, to tell stories, to teach, to argue, to negotiate, to plan, to coordinate complex activities across time and space. If our ancestors 200,000 years ago had language, even if it wasn't quite as complex as modern language, they had a tool for sharing knowledge that would leave no archaeological trace but would profoundly shape their lives. They could tell each other about water sources beyond the horizon. They could warn about dangerous animals. They could pass down information about which plants were safe to eat. They could discuss where to go and when to leave and who would do what. They could tell stories. Think about what stories do. They encode information in memorable form. They teach moral lessons. They explain how the world works. They bind communities together around shared narratives. They entertain and comfort and terrify. They make meaning. Your ancestors almost certainly had stories. Maybe not stories like ours, with complex plots and character development and narrative arcs, but some form of verbal art, some way of using language beyond simple information exchange. How do we know? Because every human culture ever documented has stories. Every one, without exception. Storytelling is a human universal, as fundamental to our species as upright walking or using tools. Those stories are gone, vanished into the air like breath on a cold morning. But they were there. They mattered. They were part of what made life meaningful for people who otherwise left almost nothing behind. Now consider music. Every human culture has music. Every one. People sing, people drum, people make rhythmic sounds with their voices and their bodies and whatever objects are at hand. Music is ancient, probably far older than our species. Even Neanderthals may have made music, based on what appear to be bone flutes found at some sites. Your ancestors 200,000 years ago almost certainly had music. Maybe simple music by our standards, rhythmic chanting, percussion on rocks or logs, vocalizations that merged speech and song. We can't know exactly what it sounded like, but it was there. Mothers sang to babies. Groups sang together while working or walking or celebrating. Music filled the air around ancient campfires and then disappeared, leaving nothing but silence for archaeologists to find. Consider dance, another human universal. People move their bodies rhythmically, in time with music or with each other, as a form of expression and social bonding. Dance leaves no artifacts, no traces, nothing to dig up and analyze. But it was there. Your ancestors danced. They moved together in ways that meant something to them, that created joy and connection and transcendence, and all of it is lost to us. Consider ritual. Every human society has rituals, formal actions performed in prescribed ways to mark significant moments or achieve desired outcomes. Rituals for birth, rituals for death, rituals for coming of age, rituals for marriage, rituals for healing, rituals for luck in hunting, rituals to bring rain or ward off danger. We have some evidence of early ritual behaviour, like the careful burials at school and Kafze, but we're seeing only the tip of the iceberg. The rituals that involved only bodies and voices without durable grave goods have vanished completely. The ceremonies that happened at temporary sites and left nothing behind, we can't even guess at their existence. Consider social structure. Humans live in complex social networks with rules and norms and relationships that are invisible to archaeology. Kinship systems, leadership structures, alliances and enmities, who is allowed to marry whom, how food is shared, how disputes are resolved, how children are raised. Modern hunter-gatherer societies have sophisticated social structures that would leave no archaeological trace whatsoever. Rules about residence and descent, elaborate kinship terminologies that categorize everyone into relationship categories, gift exchange networks that create obligations across generations, political processes for making group decisions. Your ancestors had something like this, maybe simpler, maybe different, but something. Some way of organizing social life beyond mere coexistence. Some set of rules and expectations that governed how people treated each other, all of it invisible to us now. Consider knowledge. Not technological knowledge, which sometimes leaves traces in tools, but knowledge about the world, understanding of animal behavior, knowledge of plant properties, mental maps of territories, weather prediction based on cloud patterns and animal behavior, medical knowledge about treating injuries and illnesses. Modern hunter-gatherers possess enormous bodies of knowledge about their environments. An experienced forager might know the properties of hundreds of plant species. An experienced hunter might understand dozens of animal species well enough to predict their movements across seasons. This knowledge is essential for survival, built up over lifetimes, passed down through generations. Your ancestors had this knowledge. They had to, or they wouldn't have survived. But it existed only in minds and in oral tradition. It left no physical traces for us to find. When we look at the sparse archaeological record from 200,000 years ago and see apparent simplicity, we're not seeing the richness of knowledge that made that life possible. Consider beliefs. What did your ancestors think about the world? What did they believe happened after death? What did they think caused illness or bad luck? How did they explain natural phenomena? What did they think about the stars? We can't know. Beliefs don't fossilize. But every human culture has beliefs, explanations for how the world works and what it means. Your ancestors weren't walking around with blank minds, waiting for religion to be invented. They had beliefs. They had ways of making sense of their experience. They had what we might call spirituality or worldview or cosmology, and all of it has vanished. Consider emotions, love, grief, joy, fear, jealousy, compassion, pride, shame. The full range of human emotional experience was present in humans 200,000 years ago because emotion is built into our biology. Our ancestors loved their children and mourned their dead and feared dangerous animals and felt pride in successful hunts and experienced jealousy over mates and everything else that humans feel. These emotions shaped their lives profoundly. They motivated behavior. They gave meaning to experience. They made life worth living even when that life was hard. And they left no trace whatsoever in the archaeological record. What I'm trying to convey is that the apparent poverty of the early human record is largely an illusion created by the limitations of archaeology. We can only see what preserves, and most of what makes human life human doesn't preserve. The missing 200,000 years weren't empty. They were full of language and story and music and dance and ritual and social complexity and knowledge and belief and emotion, full of everything that matters to human beings. We just can't see it. This doesn't mean there was no change over time. There was. The revolution was real, in the sense that something changed in human behavior and left dramatically more traces in the archaeological record. But the change wasn't from emptiness to fullness. It was from one kind of fullness to another, from a way of life that left few traces to a way of life that left many. Understanding this helps us ask better questions about the transition. Not how did humans acquire the capacity for complex behavior, because they had that capacity all along, but what changed to make complex behavior more frequent, more cumulative, more archaeologically visible. To answer that question, we need to think about the conditions that allow cultural complexity to flourish. We need to think about population and connection and the strange mathematics of innovation. But first, let's take a moment to appreciate our ancestors as they really were. Not as primitives waiting to evolve, not as empty vessels waiting to be filled with culture, but as complete human beings, living lives of meaning and purpose, doing everything that humans do except leaving behind the kinds of traces we can find. If you're falling asleep now, let this thought carry you into dreams. Imagine an ancestor from 200,000 years ago. Imagine them singing to a child. Imagine them telling a story around a fire. Imagine them dancing with their family, feeling the joy of movement and togetherness. Imagine them looking up at the stars and wondering what they are, just as you wonder about them. They were you. You are them. The differences between you are smaller than you might think, and the continuities are vast. You are part of an unbroken chain of human experience stretching back to the very beginning of our species. Rest now, dream of ancestors, and when you wake, we'll continue exploring the mystery of what changed to make the revolution possible. Chapter 5. The Mathematics of Innovation. I want to tell you about a mathematical principle that might explain the missing 200,000 years. It's not the only explanation, but it's compelling, and it connects the deep past to patterns we can observe in the present. The principle is sometimes called the collective brain hypothesis. It goes like this. Innovation depends not just on individual intelligence, but on the size and connectedness of populations. Larger, more connected populations produce more innovations and preserve them better over time. Smaller, more isolated populations produce fewer innovations and tend to lose the ones they have. This sounds obvious when you state it plainly, but the implications are profound. It means that the same individual human brains can produce very different levels of cultural complexity depending on how many of those brains are connected to each other. It means that what looks like cognitive limitation might actually be demographic limitation. It means that the missing 200,000 years might not reflect what our ancestors couldn't do, but rather the circumstances they lived in. Let me explain how this works. Imagine you're a member of a small band of 30 people. Someone in your band invents something useful. A new technique for flaking stone, maybe, or a new way of preparing food. This innovation improves life for your band. It spreads among the 30 of you. Children learn it from their parents. For a while, it persists. But your band is vulnerable if a drought kills too many people, if a disease sweeps through the group, if the band splits and one fragment loses all the elders who knew the technique. Any of these events could erase the innovation. It could simply be forgotten, dying out even though it was useful, because there weren't enough people maintaining the knowledge to preserve it through disruption. Now imagine instead that you're part of a network of bands totaling 1,000 people. The same innovation happens, but now it spreads more widely. More people know it. More people are teaching it to their children. The chances that it survives any given disruption are much higher because the knowledge is distributed across multiple groups. Even if one band suffers catastrophe, others preserve the technique. And here's the key insight. In the larger population, innovations accumulate. Each generation inherits the innovations of previous generations and adds new ones. The cultural toolkit grows over time. It ratchets upward instead of oscillating up and down. This is what researchers call cumulative cultural evolution, the ability of human populations to accumulate knowledge and complexity across generations, building on what came before rather than starting fresh each time. It's one of the most distinctive features of human culture, and it's what allows us to achieve things no individual could accomplish alone. But cumulative cultural evolution depends on population size and connectivity. In small, isolated populations, the ratchet slips. Innovations are made, but then lost. Each generation might be no better off than the one before, not because people are incapable of innovation, but because innovations don't persist. There's evidence for this in the archaeological record. At times when human populations grew or became more connected, cultural complexity increased. At times when populations shrank or became more isolated, complexity decreased. The most dramatic example comes from Tasmania. When sea levels rose at the end of the last ice age, Tasmania became an island, cut off from mainland Australia. The Aboriginal population on Tasmania became isolated, numbering perhaps 4,000 people with limited contact between groups. Over the following millennia, the Tasmanians actually lost technologies that they had previously possessed. They stopped making bone tools. They stopped making cold-weather clothing. They stopped eating fish, even though they lived on an island surrounded by fish. Their toolkit became simpler over time, not more complex. This wasn't because Tasmanians were less intelligent than mainland Australians. They had the same brains, the same cognitive potential. But their small, isolated population couldn't maintain the cultural complexity that a larger, more connected population could sustain. The collective brain was too small. When Europeans arrived, they mistook this cultural simplicity for primitive stupidity. They didn't understand that they were seeing the effects of demography, not biology. They didn't realize that the same process could happen to any human population under the same conditions. Now think about early Homo sapiens during the missing 200,000 years. Population was small, very small, maybe tens of thousands of people total, spread across an entire continent. Groups were isolated. Travel was difficult and dangerous. The social networks that would later span continents were limited to nearby bands at most. In these conditions, the collective brain hypothesis predicts exactly what we see in the archaeological record. Sporadic innovation, complexity that appears and disappears, a pattern of flickering rather than steady growth. The capacity for innovation was present, but the demographic conditions for cumulative culture were not. The revolution, in this view, was primarily a demographic transition. Something happened to increase human population size and connectivity enough to cross a threshold. Once that threshold was crossed, innovation started accumulating instead of disappearing. The cultural ratchet engaged, and what had been a slow trickle of complexity became a flood. What caused the demographic transition? Multiple factors, probably reinforcing each other. Climate may have played a role. The period between about 70,000 and 60,000 years ago saw significant climate fluctuations that might have pushed populations together, forcing more interaction and exchange. After about 60,000 years ago, conditions stabilized somewhat, allowing populations to grow. The spread of humans out of Africa may have been both cause and effect of population growth. As groups expanded into new territories, they encountered new resources and opportunities. Successful expansion created more people who could expand further in a positive feedback loop. Technological innovations may have helped too. Better hunting techniques, better ways of processing food, better clothing and shelter for dealing with harsh environments. Each innovation that improved survival would tend to increase population, which would improve the conditions for further innovation. And language may have been key. If language became more complex or more widely shared during this period, it would have dramatically increased the efficiency of cultural transmission. Information could spread faster and more accurately. Knowledge could be preserved more reliably. The collective brain would work better even at the same population size. All of these factors probably contributed. Demographic change wasn't a single event, but a gradual process, with multiple causes and multiple effects feeding back on each other. But the mathematical core of the explanation remains. The missing 200,000 years were a time when human populations were below the threshold needed for sustained cumulative culture. The revolution happened when populations crossed that threshold, not a sudden genetic change, not a miraculous awakening of human potential, just demographics. This explanation is satisfying in some ways and unsatisfying in others. It accounts for the pattern we see in the archaeological record. It fits with mathematical models of cultural evolution. It's supported by examples like Tasmania. But it feels somehow deflating. We want the story of human progress to be about great minds and heroic achievements, not about population density crossing some critical value. But here's another way to think about it. The collective brain hypothesis puts the achievement where it belongs, not in any individual, but in human sociality itself. Our greatest accomplishment as a species isn't any particular invention or artwork. It's our ability to cooperate, to share information, to build on each other's contributions across generations. We are the animal that learned to think together. The missing 200,000 years weren't a failure. They were the long childhood of humanity, the time when we were developing the social and communicative abilities that would eventually allow our collective intelligence to flourish. The sparse archaeological record from that period isn't evidence of empty minds. It's evidence of small populations doing the best they could with what they had. And when the conditions finally came together, when population and connection reached critical mass, everything our ancestors had always been capable of finally had room to express itself. The revolution wasn't about becoming human. It was about being human in large enough numbers to matter. If you're drifting towards sleep now, think about this. Think about how your own creativity depends on others, the ideas you have that build on things you learned, the projects you accomplish with help from others, the knowledge you possess that you inherited from past generations. You, like your ancestors, are part of a collective brain. Your intelligence isn't just your own. We are what we are because we are many. That was true 200,000 years ago, when our ancestors struggled to maintain cultural complexity in small, isolated groups. It's true today, when our connected world allows innovations to spread at the speed of light. The lesson of the missing years is that we need each other. We always have. Rest now. Let your mind join the great collective dreaming of humanity, and when you wake, we'll continue exploring the past that made your present possible. Chapter 6. the coastal path. Let's travel somewhere specific now. Let's leave the abstractions of population mathematics and go to a particular place at a particular time, a place that might have been crucial in the transition from flickering innovation to sustained cultural complexity. We're going to the southern coast of Africa, sometime between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago. This is where some of the most remarkable evidence for early human behavioral complexity has been found. This is where our ancestors may have first crossed the threshold that would eventually change everything. Picture yourself there. The landscape is different from the African interior that birthed our species. Here, where the continent ends and the ocean begins, a narrow strip of land offers resources available nowhere else. The cold Benguela current sweeps up from the Antarctic, bringing nutrient-rich water that supports abundant marine life. Tide pools teem with shellfish. Seabirds nest on rocky cliffs. Whales and seals and dolphins populate the offshore waters. This coast is a refuge. When conditions inland become harsh, when droughts dry up the rivers and game migrates away, the coast remains productive. The ocean doesn't stop providing food. The tides keep bringing shellfish within reach. People can survive here when they couldn't survive elsewhere. And survival matters more than usual during this period. The climate is volatile. Ice ages and warm periods alternate unpredictably. Some researchers think that between 195,000 and 130,000 years ago, human populations crashed to dangerously low levels, perhaps as few as a few thousand breeding individuals. Another bottleneck, another near-extinction event. If this hypothesis is correct, the coastal regions of southern Africa might have been among the refugia where humans survived. Small bands clinging to the edges of the continent, while the interior became uninhabitable. Populations concentrated, forced into contact with each other, living at densities higher than anywhere else humans existed. And here, in this crucible, something remarkable seems to have happened. Look at the archaeological sites along this coast. Blombos Cave, which we've already discussed, with its engraved ochre and shell beads. Pinnacle Point, where humans were exploiting marine resources and heat-treating stone 164,000 years ago. Claysy's river mouth, where complex behaviours appear and disappear across thousands of years. Deep Kloof, with its engraved ostrich eggshells. These sites show more evidence of behavioural complexity than anywhere else in Africa during this period. Symbolic artefacts, sophisticated technology, systematic use of marine resources, trade in materials over long distances. Something was different here. Something was happening that wasn't happening elsewhere. The collective brain hypothesis offers an explanation. If populations were concentrated along this coast, if groups were living in closer contact than usual, if information could flow more easily between bands, then all the preconditions for cumulative culture would be enhanced. More people connected together means more innovation preserved. More innovation preserved means faster cultural evolution. The coast might have been humanity's first experiment in high-density living. Not cities, nothing like that, but population densities high enough to cross the threshold for sustained cultural accumulation. A laboratory where the social and cognitive abilities that our species had possessed for hundreds of thousands of years could finally be expressed at scale. Think about what this environment offered beyond just food. Shellfish are a reliable resource. Unlike hunting, which is uncertain and dangerous, gathering shellfish is something almost anyone can do almost any day. Children can do it. Elderly people can do it. Pregnant women can do it. It's slow and tedious, but it's predictable. This reliability changes the economics of survival. When you're not constantly worried about where your next meal is coming from, you have cognitive resources to spare. You can think about things beyond immediate survival. You can experiment. You can play. You can create. Modern studies of hunter-gatherers show that people in resource-rich environments have more leisure time than people in harsh environments. They can afford to specialize. They can develop expertise in things beyond the basic necessities. They can accumulate cultural complexity. The coast also offers opportunities for trade. Different stretches of coastline have different resources. One area might have good stone for toolmaking, another might have particular shellfish species, a third might have ochre deposits. Trade allows groups to specialize and exchange, increasing the diversity of resources available to everyone, and the coast is a linear environment. Unlike the sprawling savannas of the interior, where groups can move in any direction and quickly lose track of each other, the coast channels movement along predictable paths. It's easier to maintain contact with other groups, when everyone is following the same narrow strip of land. Social networks naturally form along the coast in ways they might not elsewhere. All of these factors might have combined to create unusually favourable conditions for cultural evolution along the southern African coast. Population concentration, resource reliability, trade opportunities, easy communication, the collective brain growing larger and more connected than it had ever been before. Did the revolution start here? Some researchers think so. They argue that the cognitive and cultural foundations for behavioural modernity were laid along this coast during the periods when humans concentrated here to survive climate crises. The innovations made here spread inland when conditions improved and populations expanded. The coast was the source, and the rest of the world was downstream. Others are more cautious. They point out that the archaeological record is always biased toward places where preservation is good and research has been done. Caves near coastlines preserve artifacts well and attract archaeologists. Similar complexity might have existed in other places that we haven't investigated as thoroughly or where preservation was poor. This is a genuine debate, and I won't pretend to resolve it. But there's something compelling about the coastal hypothesis, something that feels right about the idea that the sea, which has always drawn humans, played a role in making us who we are. If you've ever stood at the edge of the ocean and felt the pull of it, the sense of possibility and endlessness, you're feeling something your ancestors felt 100,000 years ago. They looked out at the same water. They wondered about the same horizon. They harvested the same kinds of shellfish and watched the same kinds of seabirds. And they did something unprecedented. They created art and symbolism and complex technology on a scale never seen before. They laid the foundations for everything that would follow. They started humanity on the path that would eventually lead to you. The coast might have been our nursery, the place where we grew from scattered bands of survivors into a species ready to take over the world. Chapter 7. The expansion begins. Something happened around 70,000 years ago, or maybe 80,000, or maybe 60,000. The dates are fuzzy, the evidence is fragmentary, but the basic story is clear. Humans started to leave Africa. This wasn't the first attempt. Anatomically, modern humans had reached the Middle East before, maybe 120,000 years ago. But those populations didn't persist. They either died out or retreated back into Africa. The early exits failed, but the exit around 70,000 years ago was different. This time, the humans who left kept going. They spread along the southern coast of Asia, reaching Australia by at least 65,000 years ago. They moved into Europe by 45,000 years ago. Eventually, they would reach every continent except Antarctica, adapt to every environment from tropical rainforest to Arctic tundra, and become the most widely distributed large mammal in Earth's history. What made this exit different from the earlier ones? Why did humans suddenly succeed in colonizing the world when they had failed before? The standard answer involves behavioral modernity. The humans who left Africa this time had something their predecessors lacked: fully developed symbolic culture, complex language, sophisticated technology, the whole package of cognitive and cultural abilities that define modern humans. They were smarter, or at least more culturally equipped, and that made the difference. But we've already questioned the premise of this argument. We've seen that the capacity for complex behaviour existed long before the expansion. The spark was present. What changed was the conditions that allowed it to become a flame. Here's an alternative story. The humans who left Africa around 70,000 years ago weren't fundamentally different from the humans who had tried and failed before, but they came from populations that had crossed the demographic threshold for sustained cultural accumulation. They carried with them not just their genes, but a cultural toolkit that had been building for thousands of years in the crucible of the coastal refugia. They had more technology, more knowledge, more cultural complexity to draw on as they faced new challenges. They also had momentum. Growing populations push outward. As one area fills up, people move into adjacent areas. As long as conditions are favourable and there are places to go, expansion continues. The humans leaving Africa weren't explorers in the romantic sense, consciously setting out to discover new lands. They were populations overflowing, each generation moving a little farther than the last, following coastlines and river valleys, and routes of least resistance. The coastal route hypothesis suggests that the first wave of expansion followed the southern coast of Asia. People who had spent thousands of years adapting to coastal life in Africa simply continued what they knew. They moved along the shores of Arabia, Iran, India, Southeast Asia, eventually reaching Australia. The ocean provided familiar resources. The coastline provided a navigable path. The skills developed in Africa transferred to new environments, and they moved fast. Perhaps faster than archaeologists once thought possible. Genetic evidence suggests that the populations who became Aboriginal Australians separated from other human lineages around 70,000 years ago. If they reached Australia by 65,000 years ago, that means they covered the distance from Africa to Australia in just a few thousand years. Maybe less. This speed suggests something important. These weren't isolated bands struggling to survive in unfamiliar territory. They were successful populations expanding into new niches, bringing their cultural toolkit with them, adapting to local conditions while maintaining connections back along the route of expansion. Think about what this expansion meant for the collective brain. Previously, humans had been confined to Africa, with total population maybe in the tens or hundreds of thousands. Now they were spreading across the entire Old World tropics, with population growing into the millions. The geographic range for innovation expanded enormously. More people in more places meant more opportunities for cultural creativity, and the expansion itself selected for adaptability. The populations that succeeded were the ones that could adjust to new environments, develop new technologies, solve new problems. Selection pressure favoured innovation, cultural evolution accelerated. Meanwhile, back in Africa, populations were also growing and spreading into previously uninhabited areas as the climate improved. The expansion out of Africa wasn't a replacement of African populations, but an addition to them. The collective brain was growing everywhere. The expansion also brought humans into contact with other human species. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, Denisovans in Asia and Southeast Asia. Perhaps other populations we haven't yet identified. These encounters had consequences. Conflict, certainly. Competition for resources. Probably violence, though the evidence is sparse. The other human species didn't survive the arrival of Homo sapiens. Within tens of thousands of years, they were gone. We were the only humans left. But also interbreeding. We know from genetics that modern humans mated with Neanderthals and Denisovans. DNA from those populations exists in living humans today. Some of that DNA provided useful adaptations, genes for immune function and altitude tolerance, and other traits that helped our ancestors survive in new environments, and possibly cultural exchange. Could modern humans have learned things from Neanderthals? Borrowed technologies or techniques? It's plausible, but hard to prove. The archaeological record isn't clear enough to show the direction of cultural influence. What is clear is that by 40,000 years ago, the expansion had transformed the human world. We were no longer a rare African species clinging to existence in small bands. We were a global phenomenon, present on 3 continents, numbering in the millions and growing. The revolution was complete, or rather, the revolution was self-sustaining. Enough people in enough places connected enough to each other for cultural complexity to accumulate relentlessly. The flickering had become a steady flame, and that flame would only grow brighter. Chapter 8. The Explosion of Creativity. We're now in the period that archaeologists sometimes call the Upper Paleolithic, the Late Old Stone Age, roughly 50,000 to 12,000 years ago. This is when the archaeological record explodes with evidence of human creativity. This is when we start to look unmistakably, undeniably modern in our behaviour. If you've ever seen images of prehistoric cave paintings, the famous ones like Lascaux or Chauvet or Altamira, those come from this period. If you've seen the little Venus figurines, the carved female forms found across Europe, those are Upper Paleolithic. If you've heard about Ice Age hunters taking down mammoths with sophisticated weapons, that's this period too. Let me take you inside one of those caves. Not physically, obviously, but imaginatively. Let your mind go back 35,000 years to a hillside in what is now southern France. The landscape is cold, an Ice Age world of tundra and sparse forest, with glaciers covering the mountains to the south. But inside the caves, out of the wind, humans have made themselves at home. You enter the cave carrying a simple stone lamp, a shallow dish filled with animal fat with a wick of moss or plant fibre. The flame flickers as you walk, casting dancing shadows on the rough stone walls. You're not here to find shelter. There are better places for that, closer to the entrance where there's light and ventilation. You're going deep, into the darkness, into the parts of the cave that few people ever see. The passage narrows. You squeeze through gaps between rock formations, feeling the stone press against you. The air is cool and damp and utterly still. You've left the world of wind and weather behind. In here, nothing changes. In here, time itself seems to stop. And then the passage opens up, and you raise your lamp, and you see them. Horses, bison, aurochs, lions, rhinoceroses, animals painted on the walls and ceiling in sweeping lines of red and black and yellow. Animals that seem to move in the flickering light, their forms cleverly positioned along the natural contours of the rock to create an illusion of three-dimensionality. This is Chauvet Cave, or Lascaux, or Altamira, or any of dozens of painted caves scattered across Europe, each one unique, but all of them speaking to the same profound human impulse, the need to create. Who painted these images? We don't know their names. We'll never know their names. But we know something about them. They were people like you, people with families and fears and hopes, people who looked at the world and saw beauty in it, people who felt compelled to make their mark, to leave something behind, to speak across the millennia to descendants they would never meet. The paintings weren't quick work. Creating them required planning and effort. Pigments had to be gathered and prepared. Scaffolding had to be built to reach high walls. Lamps had to be carefully maintained in the deep darkness. Artists had to develop skills through years of practice. There were master painters and apprentice painters, traditions passed down through generations. And the paintings weren't just decoration. They meant something. We don't know exactly what, the symbolism is lost to us. But the choices made by the artist tell us that meaning was present. Certain animals appear often, others appear rarely. Some are depicted with specific features highlighted. Some are shown in groups, others alone. Geometric symbols appear alongside the animal figures, abstract signs whose meaning is utterly opaque to us, but clearly communicated something to the people who made them. This is art. Real art, as sophisticated and intentional as anything humans have created since. The artists of the Upper Paleolithic were not primitive people taking their first fumbling steps toward culture. They were masters of their craft, inheritors of traditions that had been developing for tens of thousands of years. But the caves are just the beginning. Let me show you what else was happening during this period. People were carving, small figurines from ivory, bone, stone, animals and humans and hybrid creatures. The famous Venus figurines, female forms with exaggerated features, found from France to Siberia. These weren't idle whittling. They were objects of power and meaning, carefully made and carefully used. People were making music, flutes carved from the wing bones of swans and vultures, with precisely spaced finger holes to produce different notes. Instruments that could play recognizable melodies, that required skill to make and skill to play. Music around campfires in the Ice Age night. Songs and rhythms and harmonies that have been lost to time but were surely there. People were decorating themselves. Beads made from shells and teeth and ivory, sometimes traded over hundreds of miles from their origins, pendants and bracelets and necklaces, ornaments that communicated identity, status, group membership, individual expression. People were burying their dead with elaborate care, bodies placed in deliberate positions, sprinkled with red ochre, surrounded by grave goods, beads, tools, animal bones, signs of mourning and love and belief in something beyond death, rituals that marked the passage from life to whatever comes after. People were building. Not permanent structures, not yet, but sophisticated shelters made from mammoth bones and animal hides. In the cold steppes of what is now Ukraine and Russia, where wood was scarce, people used mammoth tusks and bones as building materials, creating dwellings that could shelter groups through brutal Ice Age winters. People were hunting more effectively than ever before, spear throwers that extended the range and power of thrown weapons, bows and arrows in some times and places, elaborate strategies for hunting large game, involving coordination among many hunters and careful knowledge of animal behavior. People were trading. Obsidian from specific volcanic sources appears hundreds of miles away. Shells from the Mediterranean appear in Central Europe. Materials moved along networks of exchange that spanned vast distances, carried by people who might never meet the ultimate consumers, but were connected through chains of relationship and obligation. All of this was happening during the Upper Paleolithic. All of this creativity and complexity and cultural richness. And it was happening everywhere humans lived, not just in Europe but in Asia, Africa, Australia, eventually the Americas. The missing 200,000 years were over. The revolution had happened. Humans had become fully, visibly, unmistakably modern in their behaviour. But here's what I want you to understand. The people who painted Chauvet Cave weren't a different species from the people who lived during the missing years. They weren't smarter. They didn't have better brains. They were the same humans, with the same cognitive potential, living under different conditions. The revolution wasn't about evolution. It was about circumstances, about population and connection, and the accumulation of culture across generations. The spark had always been there. What changed was that the spark finally had enough fuel to become a fire. And once that fire was burning, nothing could put it out. Chapter 9. Why it matters. If you're still with me, if you're drifting somewhere between waking and sleep, listening to these words about times so remote they hardly seem real, you might be wondering why any of this matters. What does it mean for you, here and now, that your ancestors spent 200,000 years doing things that didn't leave traces in the archaeological record? Let me tell you why I think it matters. First, it matters for how we understand ourselves. The standard story of human progress, the one we tell ourselves in school and in popular culture, is a story of ascent. We started out primitive and gradually became civilized. We climbed from the mud to the stars through steady improvement of our minds and cultures. But the real story is more interesting and more humbling. We didn't become who we are through steady progress. We became who we are through a sudden transition that was largely about demographics, not individual ability. Our ancestors were always capable of what we can do, they just didn't have the numbers. This should change how we think about ability and achievement. When you look at the accomplishments of human civilization, the science and art and technology that define our species, don't think of them as proof that we're special, that we're somehow better than the people who lived before. Think of them as the products of connection, as what becomes possible when billions of human minds are linked together, building on each other's work across generations. The genius isn't in any individual, the genius is in the network. And that network has been growing for a long time, but it was small and fragile for most of human existence. We're the beneficiaries of demographic good fortune as much as cognitive superiority. Second, it matters for how we think about other people. If the revolution was about circumstances rather than ability, then the people who lived during the missing 200,000 years weren't inferior to us. They weren't primitive minds trapped in modern bodies. They were people as fully human as you, living in conditions that didn't allow their full potential to be expressed. This should make us careful about judging others. When we look at societies that seem simpler or less developed than our own, we shouldn't assume they're intellectually inferior. They might just be living in circumstances that don't favour cultural complexity. Given different conditions, they might astonish us, and it should make us careful about judging ourselves. The complexity of our own civilization isn't a reflection of our superior minds. It's a reflection of our population size and connectivity. If those things changed, if catastrophe reduced human numbers and severed the connections between us, we could easily slip backward. We could lose technologies and knowledge that we take for granted. We could become archaeologically invisible ourselves. Third, it matters for how we face the future. The lesson of the missing 200,000 years is that human potential depends on connection. When people are connected, when information can flow, when innovations can spread faster than they're lost, human culture flourishes. When people are isolated, when connections break down, culture contracts. This is relevant today. We're more connected than ever before. Information flows at the speed of light. The collective brain is larger and more integrated than at any point in history. This connectivity is what makes modern science and technology possible. It's what allows innovations in one place to spread everywhere almost instantly. But connectivity is fragile. Systems can break down. Networks can fragment. The infrastructure that keeps us connected requires maintenance and resources that might not always be available. If we want to maintain our trajectory of cultural accumulation, we need to protect our connections. We need to keep the collective brain functioning, and we need to be inclusive. The collective brain works better when more minds are included. When people are excluded from education or opportunity, when barriers prevent some humans from contributing, the collective loses their potential contributions. The more people who can participate in cultural creation, the more cultural creation happens. The missing 200,000 years were a time of exclusion by circumstance. Most humans who lived during that period couldn't connect with enough others to sustain cultural complexity. Their potential was wasted, not through any fault of their own, but through accidents of demography and geography. We don't have to let that happen anymore. We have the ability to include everyone, to connect every human mind to every other, to create a collective brain larger and more powerful than anything our ancestors could have imagined. Whether we do that is up to us. Fourth, and finally, it matters for how we understand what makes life meaningful. The people who lived during the missing 200,000 years didn't have art museums or libraries or all the cultural riches we enjoy, but they had each other. They had families and friends, stories and songs, love and loss. They had everything that really matters. The archaeological record is biased towards certain kinds of evidence. It preserves stone and bone, things that endure. It loses the ephemeral things, the conversations, the relationships, the experiences that make life worth living. When we look at the sparse record from the missing years and see apparent poverty, we're seeing an illusion. We're missing most of what those lives contained. And what they contained was probably not so different from what your life contains. Human nature hasn't changed. The things that mattered to your ancestors 200,000 years ago, connection and meaning and love, are the things that matter to you now. The technology is different. The scale is different. But the core experience of being human is continuous across all that time. You are connected to those ancestors, not just genetically, but experientially. When you hold someone you love, you're doing what they did. When you tell a story, you're doing what they did. When you look up at the stars and wonder, you're doing what they did. The missing 200,000 years aren't really missing. They're present in you, in your body, your brain, your instincts and emotions. Every aspect of who you are was shaped during those millennia. Every human capacity you possess was honed by 200,000 years of use. You are the product of the missing years. You are where they were leading. And the story continues through you into a future that your descendants will inherit. Chapter 10. The Deep Connection. Let your breathing slow now. Let your body sink into wherever you're resting. Let the tension in your muscles dissolve. We're approaching the end of this journey through deep time, and I want to leave you with something to carry into sleep. Close your eyes if they're not already closed. Imagine yourself floating backward through time, past the noise and rush of the modern world, past the cities and nations and empires, past the beginning of writing, past the first farms and villages, past the paintings on cave walls, past the revolution that made us who we are. Keep going. Deeper into time, into the long millennia when humans existed but left so little behind. Into the 200,000 years we've been exploring together. You're floating through generations now. Hundreds of generations. Thousands of generations. Each one a full human life, with all its joys and sorrows, all its struggles and triumphs. Each one a link in the chain that connects the beginning of our species to you. And now you're there. You're in the deep past. You're standing on an African landscape under a sky full of stars, the same stars that shine above you now. The same sky that has watched over humanity for all of our existence. There's a campfire nearby. Around it, a small group of people, your ancestors. They don't know they're your ancestors, of course. They're just living their lives, getting through another day, trying to survive until tomorrow. Look at them. Really look. See how they sit together close for warmth and companionship. See how they tend the fire, adding fuel, watching the flames. See how they interact, talking or signing or communicating in whatever way they communicate. They don't have much by modern standards. Their tools are simple. Their possessions are few. They live with danger and uncertainty that you can barely imagine. But look at them. They're laughing. Someone said something funny, or made a gesture, or did something unexpected, and they're laughing. The sound rises up into the darkness. Genuine human laughter. Identical to laughter you've heard today. They love each other. The mother holding her child, the young couple sitting close together, the old man watching over everyone with experienced eyes. Love isn't a modern invention. It's ancient. It's what got them through. They have stories. The old woman is telling one now, her voice rising and falling, her hands moving to illustrate the tale. The others listen with the same attention you give to a good story. Stories matter to them as much as they matter to you. They wonder. When the story's done, someone points up at the sky, at a particularly bright star, and says something. What is that? Where does it come from? Why does it shine? They don't know the answers, and neither do you really, not in any ultimate sense. But they ask the questions. They wonder. They're curious about their world. They hope that tomorrow will be better than today, that the rains will come, that the children will grow up strong, that life will continue. They fear the darkness beyond the fire, the predators in the night, sickness and injury, death. They grieve for those they've lost, for the ones who didn't make it, for the absence that never quite heals. They are human, completely, fully human. Everything that you are, they were. The difference is circumstance, not nature. Given your opportunities, they could do what you do. Given their circumstances, you would live as they lived. Feel the connection. Feel the thread that runs from them to you through thousands of generations. You carry their DNA. You carry their instincts. You carry their capacity for love and wonder and hope and fear. You are them, continued. When you laugh with friends, they're laughing with you. When you hold someone you love, they're holding too. When you look up at the stars and wonder, you're wondering with them. The thread is unbroken. The connection is real. The missing 200,000 years aren't missing anymore. You've found them. They're inside you. They always have been. Now let yourself drift towards sleep. Let the ancient campfire fade. Let the African night give way to whatever darkness surrounds you now. But keep the connection. Keep the sense of continuity with all those lives that came before. You're part of something vast, something that stretches back 300,000 years and forward into a future you can't imagine. You're a link in a chain that has never been broken, not through ice ages and catastrophes and 200,000 years of struggle. Your ancestors survived so that you could be here, now, listening to this story. They held on through everything the world threw at them so that you could exist. And you'll pass on what you've received one way or another to the future. The story continues through you into tomorrow. Sleep now. Dream of ancestors. Dream of the long journey that brought you here. And wake tomorrow knowing that you're connected to everything that came before and everything that will come after. You are not alone. You have never been alone. You're part of the human family stretching back to the beginning and forward to wherever we're going. Sleep well, descendant of survivors, child of the missing years. The story continues. Chapter 11. What We've Found. I want to bring you back now, gently, from the deep past to the present moment. We've travelled together through 200,000 years of human existence, through the mystery of why it took so long for our species to start leaving clear traces of our cognitive potential. Let's gather what we've learned. We learned that anatomically modern humans have existed for approximately 300,000 years. For most of that time, they left behind relatively little evidence of the complex symbolic behaviour, the art and elaborate technology and long-distance trade that defines us today. We learned that this wasn't because early humans were cognitively limited. The biological capacity for everything modern humans do was present from the beginning. The brains were ready. The potential was there. We learned that the pattern in the archaeological record shows not absence but intermittence, flickering innovation, complexity that appeared and disappeared, evidence that humans could do sophisticated things but didn't do them consistently. We learned that the collective brain hypothesis offers an explanation. Innovation depends not just on individual intelligence but on population size and connectivity. In small, isolated populations, innovations are made but then lost. Only when populations grow large enough and connected enough can culture accumulate across generations. We learned that the revolution, when it came, was primarily demographic. Something happened to increase human population and connectivity, probably involving climate changes, the spread of humans out of Africa, and possibly improvements in language and technology. Once the threshold was crossed, the cultural ratchet engaged, and complexity accumulated rapidly. We learned that the coastal regions of southern Africa may have played a special role, serving as refugia during climate crises, concentrating populations, creating conditions favourable for cultural evolution. The coast may have been humanity's nursery. We learned that the expansion out of Africa, beginning around 70,000 years ago, transformed the human world. Populations grew from thousands to millions. The geographic range for innovation expanded enormously. The collective brain became too large to ignore. We learned that the Upper Paleolithic, from about 50,000 to 12,000 years ago, saw an explosion of creativity. Cave paintings and carved figurines, music and ornament, elaborate burials and sophisticated hunting. Everything we associate with human cultural complexity appeared and flourished. But we also learned that the missing 200,000 years weren't really missing. The people who lived during that time had rich lives full of meaning. They had language and story, music and dance, ritual and belief. They loved and grieved and hoped and feared. They were fully human in every way that matters. The archaeological record is biased. It preserves the durable and loses the ephemeral. Most of what made those lives meaningful has vanished without a trace, but it was there. It was always there, and we carry it with us. The instincts and emotions, the social capacities, the cognitive tools that define us were all shaped during those long millennia. We are who we are because of the missing years. They live on in us. This is what we've found. Not answers to every question, because many questions remain unanswered and may never be answered. But a framework for understanding, a way of thinking about our deep past that respects both its complexity and our continuity with it. The mystery of the missing 200,000 years isn't fully solved. It may never be fully solved, but it's less mysterious than it once was. We understand better now what those years contained and why they left so little behind. And we understand better what we are. Not the pinnacle of evolution, not the inevitable endpoint of progress, but the product of circumstances. Lucky enough to be born into an era of demographic abundance. Connected enough to benefit from the collective brain. Inheritors of 300,000 years of human experience. That's a humbling position, and a privileged one, and a responsibility. Chapter 12. Dreams of Ancestors. We're almost at the end now. The end of this journey through time, though the journey of our species continues as it always has, into whatever comes next. If you're using this to fall asleep, as many listeners do, you're approaching the moment when my voice fades and your mind drifts into whatever dreams await. I want to send you into those dreams with a final thought. When you dream tonight, you'll be using the same brain that your ancestors used 200,000 years ago. The same structures, the same capacities. When you imagine strange landscapes and encounter dream figures and experience emotions without clear cause, you're doing something that humans have done since the beginning. Did your ancestors have dreams like yours? Almost certainly. The neuroscience of dreaming is ancient. The brain states that produced dreams existed long before Homo sapiens. Your ancestors spent their nights in the same mysterious inner landscape that you visit every time you sleep. What did they dream about? We can never know for certain, but probably the same things you dream about. The people they loved, the places they knew, the fears that haunted them, the hopes that sustained them, mixed together in the strange logic of sleep, creating experiences that feel real and meaningful, even when they make no sense. Maybe they dreamed of the future, not literally, not prophetically, but in the way that all humans dream of tomorrow, hoping for good weather, imagining successful hunts, worrying about dangers to come. Their dreaming minds, like yours, couldn't help but reach forward into time, trying to anticipate what lay ahead. They couldn't have anticipated you, couldn't have imagined the world you live in. But in some sense, they dreamed you into existence. Their hopes and struggles and decisions, accumulating across thousands of generations, created the conditions for your life. You are their dream made real, and your dreams will shape the future in ways you can't anticipate. The things you hope for, the decisions you make, the children you might raise, or the ideas you might share, all of it will ripple forward into a future you'll never see. You're dreaming the next world into existence, just as your ancestors dreamed yours. This is the thread that connects all human lives, the continuous dreaming, the reaching toward tomorrow, the hope that keeps us going. It never stops. It can't stop. It's what we are. So dream tonight. Dream of ancestors gathered around ancient fires. Dream of the long journey from Africa to wherever you are now. Dream of all the lives that came before yours, each one a full world of experience, each one a step on the path that led to you. And dream of the future, not with worry but with hope. The same hope your ancestors felt when they looked at their children and imagined what those children might become. The same hope that has carried humanity through ice ages and catastrophes and 200,000 years of struggle. You are part of that hope. You are its current embodiment, and you'll pass it on, whether you know it or not, to whatever comes next. The story of the missing 200,000 years is your story. The people who lived through those years are your people. The mystery of why it took so long for human potential to fully express itself is a mystery about you, about what you are, about the strange and wonderful accident that produced human civilization. We still don't know everything. We'll never know everything. But we know more than we did. And knowing connects us to all those who knew before us, and all those who will know after. That's what it means to be human. To wonder, to seek understanding, to pass on what we've learned. Sleep now, dream of ancestors, wake tomorrow knowing that you're connected to 300,000 years of human wondering. The story continues through you, and that's beautiful. Conclusion. The ongoing mystery. I've been talking for a long time now. If you're still listening, if you haven't drifted off to sleep, thank you for staying with me through this exploration of the missing 200,000 years. Before I let you go, I want to acknowledge something important. We've covered a lot of ground tonight, but I've been presenting one perspective, one interpretation of the evidence. The reality is that debates continue among researchers. Not everyone agrees with the collective brain hypothesis. Not everyone thinks the revolution was primarily demographic. New discoveries keep reshaping our understanding. The Jebel Irhoud fossils that pushed back the origin of our species to 300,000 years ago were only published in 2017. The analysis of coastal adaptations in South Africa is ongoing. The question of when and how fully modern language evolved is far from settled. The puzzle of what our ancestors were really doing during those long millennia remains genuinely puzzling. I've told you the story that makes the most sense to me based on current evidence. But I could be wrong. The next discovery might force us to revise everything. That's how science works. That's how understanding grows. What I'm confident about is this. The people who lived during the missing 200,000 years were as fully human as you. They weren't primitive minds trapped in modern bodies. They weren't waiting for evolution to finish their brains. They were complete, with all the cognitive and emotional capacities that you possess. The difference between them and us is circumstance. We're born into a world of nearly 8 billion connected minds, inheriting a cultural toolkit that's been accumulating for thousands of generations. They were born into small groups struggling to survive, separated from each other by vast distances and difficult terrain. Given their circumstances, we would have lived as they lived. Given our circumstances, they would have lived as we live. That's the deepest lesson of the missing years. Humanity isn't about individuals. It's about connection. It's about what becomes possible when minds work together across time and space. The revolution that made us who we are was a revolution in connection, not in capability. And that revolution continues. Every time you learn something new, you're adding to the collective. Every time you share an idea, you're strengthening the network. Every time you create something, you're contributing to the ongoing accumulation of human culture. You're part of the biggest experiment in collective intelligence the universe has ever seen. An experiment that started in small bands on the African savanna and now spans the entire planet. An experiment that produced everything from cave paintings to space stations. An experiment that shows no signs of stopping. Where is it going? What will humans be doing 200,000 years from now? We can't know. The future is as opaque to us as our present would have been to our ancestors, but it will come, and it will be shaped in part by what you do today. That's a lot of pressure, but it's also an invitation. You get to participate, you get to contribute, you get to be part of the ongoing story that started before history and will continue after your individual story ends. The missing 200,000 years are behind us, but they're also within us, and ahead of us lies whatever we choose to create together. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I made it. Drop a comment and let me know where you're listening from. I check comments and it's wild. Tokyo at dawn, London at lunch, Sydney at midnight, all listening to the same story about where we came from. We're connected, across time zones and continents, across the vast distances that would have made communication impossible for our ancestors. We're the global brain they never could have imagined. Use that connection well. Add something to the collective, strengthen the network, and remember, always, that you're part of something much bigger than yourself. The story continues. Good night.